Welcome, everyone. We'll get started shortly, but before we start, I'd like to give people a few more moments to get their audio preferences settled and ready for beginning. All right, we have a great session today with LeRoy and Helen. All right, well, welcome to today's webinar. Before I hand it off to our moderator and our panelists, I just want to cover a few technical details in case you haven't joined AACRAO webinar in the past. We use Zoom webinar, which is similar to Zoom meeting, except that your cameras and your microphones are disabled by default. To interact with each other or with the presenters, you have two main options. One is to use the chat button. This will default to the hosts and panelists, meaning only they can see your message. If you want everyone, however, to see your message, please go ahead and hit the drop-down menu to show everyone. And if you have any questions for LeRoy and Helen, please make sure to post it in the Q&A button. You can ask your question anonymously, you can ask it at any time, and you can even comment on your question. And now, with any further ado, I would like to hand it off to Helen and LeRoy.
Well, thank you so much, Velma. Hi, everyone. My name is Helen Garrett. I'm the University Registrar at the University of Washington in Seattle. And we are so thrilled to bring to you one of the most popular sessions at the annual AACRAO meeting each year, which is Ask the FERPA Professor, LeRoy Rooker, anything questions you have. So this is our first try at this. So so we may be making changes depending on how this goes. So thanks for being here, all 130 of you. So glad you signed up. And I am so thrilled to have LeRoy Rooker here, who is an AACRAO fellow. He's been with AACRAO since 2009. And before that, for 21 years, was in the main, what we think of as the FERPA office, the Family Compliance Office to the Department of Education. And if you've been around the FERPA block for even just a minute, there's no way you can't know who LeRoy is. He's amazing. He and I have worked together for a long time. And the way that this is going to work is you will, and go ahead and start posting your questions so we can see them there in the Q&A. We will look at your question as they come in, and I will read the question to LeRoy. What I love so much about LeRoy is I have to be a trainer. I get to be a trainer for FERPA on my campus and a resource. And what I love about the way that LeRoy answers questions, and I've tried to model my practice after that, is he doesn't just answer the question, he'll help you understand where in the FERPA law and the interpretation of FERPA, why is this the case? So while we wait for some questions to load up, so go ahead, start loading those questions in. If you're having any trouble, then you can jump over to chat and let Velma know what's happening there. But I thought I would just, first of all, LeRoy, hello and welcome.
Hello, Helen, and everyone.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah,
Let me lob a question to you that you and I get all the time to kick things off, and then we'll answer this one question, and then we'll go hit the questions online. So the question I get constantly, I wish I got it more, is when you think of education records directly related to a student maintained by the institution, when is it not okay to share education records using email?
So in terms of email, well, one thing to kind of start off with the observation that FERPA is technology neutral. So whatever technology an institution chooses to use, FERPA doesn't address that. What FERPA addresses is whatever technology you use can't result in an unauthorized disclosure of educational records. So when you think about email, email is not a secure medium. You can certainly, there are ways you can make it more secure. But as I do training on campuses, one of the things I'm always talking about is using your institutional assigned email in any kind of communication. And particularly with the students, oftentimes you'll have students who want to have the communication sent to their personal email, for example, but that I was just on a campus yesterday talking about this very issue and the fact that you want to, one, can tell the student this is to protect your privacy and our institution, because institutions can't be in the business of sending education records to emails and email addresses where they don't have they don't know who's on the other end of it or who could get access to it. If you use the institutional email, then there's a secret PIN or password, and you can communicate in that form or fashion with the student. So just from a best practice standpoint, you really want to keep it only with institutional emails. You can always tell the student, hey, you can forward this to your personal email from your institutional if you want to, and just have it automatically go over there. But in terms of communicating with us, we only communicate to and only want to hear from your institutional email.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add that even if something is permissible, as LeRoy has just identified in the best practice under FERPA, always think about exercising caution with emails, because they can grow and grow and grow. And that's where we're seeing most of our breaches. So I always say, if I don't know who I'm sending it to, I cut those people out of the to and the CC. And I'm super careful about emails to make sure that down below isn't student education information. I didn't realize was hanging out down below, because now we're talking about some new process change. So use emails in the way that LeRoy has said, but please exercise caution, because this is the #1 way we're seeing breaches happen on our campuses.
Yeah,
go ahead, LeRoy.
And to be sure that if you're sending something and you've got multiple parties on that, that you blind those in terms of anybody being able to see. That is that's a common error that that goes on at institutions, where the sender forgets that they can't send something with everybody's name and contact info appearing.
All right, well, we've been gifted with about 7 questions. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now. So the first one is, LeRoy, what are the difference between FERPA and FOIA, or Public Records Act records?
Sure. So freedom of information, a couple of things. There's freedom of information, which is there's a federal law that says Privacy Act. That's one, but there's also your state open records. And the way FERPA works is you can disclose information under FERPA to any party, so long as 1, the student has provided a consent, or 2, the conditions of one of the exceptions to signed consent, which is found in 99.31 of the regulations, so long as the conditions of one of those exceptions is met. What you can't do is, so with state law, state open records, for example, you can have state open records laws that require you to disclose information that, such as directory information, which you can disclose in any student who hadn't opted out. So you can do that, and that's fine. But what you can't have is a state open records law that requires you to disclose something that FERPA doesn't permit. So that's the big piece that's there, and the big difference.
And my best advice to you, thank you, LeRoy, is if you're new to your registrar role or whatever, if you're responsible for the records on your campus, please reach out to the individual on your campus that is responsible for public records. Each state has different laws, and create a very tight relationship. So we've got one at the University of Washington. They're not allowed to ask who the requester is, but as soon as records come in and they see that they're about a student or about the requester as a student, they come back over the wall to my office, that 45-day response window is going. So really work on developing that relationship with whoever handles public records, so you're super clear on what do they respond to, what do you respond to.
Right, and one of the things I'll just add to that is that if any response that an institution does has to be done under FERPA, not under open records. It may answer an open records request, but your ability to disclose it has to be found in FERPA.
That's exactly true. Right. Wonderful. Thank you. What level of security should be in place to confirm that the person you're speaking to is on the FERPA consent form? I think I'll start with you, LeRoy, in terms of seeding this in the law, and then I might give some best practice after. So how much security or what level has to be in place to make sure that you're actually talking to the person that's provided consent?
Well, again, what FERPA requires is that institutions use reasonable methods to authenticate the identity of any individual before you provide access to education records to them. Most common person that you deal with there, where that would be an issue, is the student. You may get the phone call from the student to say, in identifying themselves as a student and requesting certain information from an education record. You have different ways, and the regulations provide different ways. You may have security questions established for them. You may have the different PIN numbers or passwords that they would use if they are doing phone calls. But if you don't have something like that, you also have the means to say, we'll send this, where you get into that, harken back to the discussion we had about institutional emails, where you could say, I'm going to send that information to your institutional assigned email. And where, because I can't identify you over the phone, but I know I can send it to your institutional email. Another thing, another way you could do this is you could, and we've gotten more into this using WebEx or Zoom, or having these conversations where you can view the student. You could have the student hold up a driver's license to identify themselves. So you've got, or a student ID. So different ways you can do that. But again, FERPA just says you've got to use those reasonable methods in order to do that, and that you can't be disclosing education records inappropriately.
That's great. I am not a fan of paper forms giving consent, and hopefully we're well past that thanks to the pandemic. But we have taken care at the University of Washington, whether it's sharing records across the campus or certainly with our records request form, the individual has to authenticate in using their credentials known only to them, even to get to the request form, or they have to authenticate in to pick up an education record from us. It provides that extra layer of security that if the student were to register a complaint with the Department of Education or your institution that their information was provided to someone they shouldn't, if you can verify that someone with credentials that they had known only to them were provided access to you, then you've got that extra layer to show that you put that security in place. So great question. Okay, third question. Sending transcripts via email with a secure link, okay or not okay?
Again, back to the technology issue, as long as sending them is not gonna, is reasonably and certain not to create a inappropriate disclosure. And again, one of the things you would do is the important piece there is to know that you are authorized to send that transcript in the first place, either through a consent, or maybe a student is seeking or intending to enroll in another institution, and you're sending a transcript or other records via secure means. You can do that if you know they are seeking or intending to enroll. Don't need a consent. But if you're sending them to say a potential employer or something like that, then you would most definitely want to have a consent before you send it in any format.
Yep. What I love about the FERPA law that's going to celebrate its 50th birthday next year is that it's technology agnostic. They had no idea about the internet or emails to come, and it's actually served us really well. So we encourage you to not get focused on the technology always as much as what is the principle behind it. If we had to defend that we took a reasonable care to make sure that the wrong information didn't go to the wrong person. How could we defend that? So again, if you're providing a link, you just want to make sure that you are absolutely positive it's going to the right individual using their credentials known only to them to log in. So great. Okay, let me go back to the top here. Let's see. Other than submitting individual FERPA forms, is there another way to handle sharing information to guidance counselors in dual credit situations? And I think we might be talking about our colleagues either in the high schools that are getting credit both at our schools and the high school otherwise.
So other than, give me that question once more at the
So
beginning.
other than asking each of the students who are in a dual credit circumstance where they're attending two different, it could be
Right.
K-12 and post-secondary, and sending in individual forms, is there another way to handle sharing information with guidance counselors in those situations? So what does FERPA allow us to do in terms of sharing educational records back and forth that don't necessarily require those individual forms when we're in a dual credit arrangement?
Right, so if a student is receiving services from more than one institution, then the institutions are permitted to share information on that particular student. You don't need a consent to do that, but they do need to be enrolled and receiving services from both institutions. So if you've got a high school student who's taking a course that's part of the credit's going to go back to the high school. Not only can you send that back, whatever success or lack of success that the student had, but you can also have that provide information to their high school counselor, for example. And yeah, so FERPA permits that piece of it to do that.
Right. We know that there are a lot of things called data processing agreements or contracts that are in place. And I always like to think about what is the DNA back to the original release that it's okay to share information. So in addition to what LeRoy just said, one thing you might think about is that contract behind that education records can move between the community college and the high school or whatever the institution might be. And it's always a best practice to make sure that those students participating in those programs know at the front end what information will be shared because it can without their written permission, or when do they need to give permission. The more that you can educate your students on the front end, one, it serves for FERPA literacy, which we love, but it also just makes sure everyone knows the rules of engagement when everything's happy and at the front of a process versus later on down the road.
Yeah, and by the way, if you, when it comes to dual enrolled students and sharing information, 99.34B is something you want to look at because it talks about when the students enrolled in and receive services from between institutions or high school and college.
All right. And if you're new to the FERPA law, when LeRoy says 99.31 and 90.34, these are the different sections within the actual FERPA law that give us our guidance. And AACRAO has a fantastic FERPA guide that you can purchase that will not only lay out the law, but there are lots of examples and questions and quizzes and things like that. So I know when I first heard LeRoy 27 years ago, I'm like, what is he talking about? So he's quoting the actual section of the law. And it's a great way for you to know, like, what is the foundation behind the answer that you're giving.
Yeah, and if I was answering that question that we just did in an email, I would tell in addition to the answer, would just tell the recipient that they can find 99.34B on page 165 of the 2012 AACRAO FERPA guide.
Perfect. All right, this next one's a doozy. And Emily, I'm going to put you on the spot that I may ask you to open up your mic if I need more information, because I have never heard of anything like this. So hold on, LeRoy, here's an interesting one. Our state's PSEO, I don't know what that means, legislation requires us to include a notice to parents about enrollment, course, clock hours, and number of college credits. We try to thread the needle with FERPA by only doing this prior to the first day of classes, even though we typically define a student for FERPA purposes as an enrolled student. Is there anything else we should consider or a better solution?
So
Have you heard about this? I don't know what state it's in.
No.
I've never heard of this before.
what are the, no, I have not heard of anything like this. What's the acronym or the initials P?
Yeah, so Emily, if you're willing to open up your mic, that would help us, but it's PSEO legislation. It must be something from their particular state.
Right.
I don't know if Emily's hearing me. So I guess the
Well,
question is,
Yeah.
if post-secondary enrollment options.
Okay. Oh, she's trying to figure out how to turn on her mic. So
Oh, okay,
I'm
sorry.
with you, Emily. I wouldn't know that either. On my end, if somebody didn't do it. But
Yeah.
If there's any information, what information were they requiring? Read that piece.
So this is from Iowa, and it looks like their legislation requires to include a note to parents. Now, you haven't said whether this is just at the K-12 or post-secondary parents, because that's a very important distinction in FERPA. But it says course, clock hours, and number of college credits.
And are these students? It's K-12, but they're enrolled in college.
So high school students enrolled, not unlike dual enrollment. Yes, K-12, but college enrolled. So this is parents of K-12 students. There's a
Right.
law that says you must really, okay, that really helps, I think, in answering the question. So it's requiring you to let high school parents know about course, clock hours, and number of college credits, I presume, being taken at the post-secondary level.
Right. This is a bit of a misdirected law. It should be directed at the high school. Because the post-secondary institution, unless if the student is claimed on the parent's tax return, doing that, sending that information to them would not be a problem. But at the post-secondary level, those rights don't belong to the parent. They belong to the student. So a post-secondary institution should be providing that information back to the high school. And then if the student is under age 18, that high school should be the one providing that to the parents. So that's why I say it's a bit of a misdirected law, directing it to the post-secondary. And for the post-secondary, the only way to be in compliance with FERPA, if the post-secondary institution is doing this, is to do it under the exception in FERPA for students who are claimed on the parent's tax return.
Okay. Emily, thank you for this doozy. There's another element of this I want to pull out in terms of your FERPA policy at your institution, and how you define a student is super critical. It needs to be in your annual notice, and you have to make sure that everyone knows that. So what we want to be careful about is that you define a student for FERPA purposes as an enrolled student. So if they're a high school student, but they're enrolled at their institution, that would mean they're subject to the FERPA policy. So it's super critical that you're taking a look at what is your particular, as you said, FERPA policy around what is an enrolled student. So if we haven't answered this, I've posted, if you see it in my box on Zoom, I put my email address there, helenbg@uw.edu. I'm offering to follow up with anything. I can get to LeRoy if I need to, but if you need more help on this, Emily, this is a good one, and we'll help you navigate that. But especially in terms of if there's a law, unless a law says that you can do it anytime you want, you may have to be careful about only doing it before their first day of enrollment, depending on what the law says. So, whew, that was a tough one. All right, here's a little bit of an easier one. This is getting back to your helpful information about emailing, and you talked a lot about that you felt like it was okay if it was from an institutional assigned email account. What about a college or university that doesn't provide emails to their students, so they're just using personal? Is it okay for college officials, school officials, to be using email to send education records in that environment where it's just a personal email address only?
So if you want to do that, then the way to protect the institution is to be sure that you have a consent on file from the student that says they are authorizing you to send education records or communication to, and list the specific email address that they want you to use. It's similar to when I was at the department, we did an investigation involving a student who filed a complaint because the student had called and requested that the transcript be faxed to a particular number. The institution ended up doing that, but not immediately. At the point when the fax was received, the student was no longer at that fax, and someone else got it. Student filed a complaint with the department. We investigated, said that was a violation of FERPA because what we asked of the institution is, did you have a signed consent that said to fax this to the particular fax number? And they, of course, did not. They just simply operated from a verbal request. And so you want to make sure there are ways to do that, but you have no idea who's on the other end of that and who has access to that email. And the only way you protect the institution is to make sure that there's a consent that lists that email with and giving the institution the authority to communicate through that email address.
Yeah, the other thing that makes me nervous is we had a very big in the national newspapers situation with the student. And at the time it was happening, the student had not restricted directory information. And so our media relations folks were confirming that they were a student with us. Another publication came back this week and wanted to again confirm that this was a UW student. But when I went and looked, which I do each and every time, the student, because they can do it every 24 hours in our system, the student had gone and suppressed directory information being shared. So I had to report back to our media director, you can't release any information on this person. You can't say they have a directory hold. And like, but we let them have the information before. So I'm bringing this up because one of the things you want to be super careful about putting education records in your emails. This isn't just like, when is your office open? This is their material. If you're just sending it by email and you don't know where it's going, and they have in the last whatever time period at your institution suppressed their directory information being shared, part of that could be that they're even a student at your institution. So I just want you to think really carefully about what you're sending over by email. And the more you can use shared documents, Google Docs, internal systems where they have to log in to get what they need, the more you're going to protect yourself from what Leroy's talking about, because you actually don't know who's on the other end. And when it comes down to it, if there's a complaint made to the Department of Education or your institution, it is we who are on the hook for this, no one else. And so you just want to watch for that. Okay, and the next question, these are great. If a teacher in the classroom has an attendance roster that contains the name of the faculty member, can they pass the roster around for students to sign? I'm not sure what the name of the faculty member brings to this. So the idea is if they want to take attendance and they want to do a physical piece of paper or even electronic, doesn't matter, and can they pass it around for the students to sign?
Yeah, the answer there is yes. And even if sometimes questions have come up about someone who's and students have raised this issue where they've complained because they've opted out of directory information, but their name appears on a sign-in sheet within the classroom. FERPA is clarified under the directory information that you can't be anonymous in the classroom. So 99.37, you would get into the conditions for directory information, and in there you would find the information on classroom activities. So if that, even though that student may have opted out of directory information, in the classroom, it's fine to have the name posted, email shared, that sort of thing. What you wouldn't be able to do is do that outside the classroom with that name on it.
Okay. And certainly Zoom has changed this all immeasurably, because it used to be you could walk in a classroom and not know who people are, but when people are in an environment like this, they're often putting their names up and seeing things. So right. Yeah, that anonymous came with the changes in 2009, and it doesn't mean that the faculty member can't be sensitive to students have special concerns, but they don't have a right to be not known or not have it be seen. Great question. All right, this next one is around when students are funded by third-party entities and what we can or cannot provide. So here's the question. Our institution has partnerships with employers that send their employees to our institution where their tuition is employer paid. Our partnership team would like to use a single release form to send transcripts to the employer at the end of each semester for the student's entire enrollment. Are there concerns with this?
So when you think about students who are receiving financial aid, you want to look at 99.31A4, which is the financial aid exception. And what it talks about is conditions under which you can disclose information to determine eligibility for the aid, determine the amount, or importantly, with what you're asking now is in terms of disclose for purposes of complying with the terms and conditions, providing information for whatever the agreement that the student may have signed. That's what's going to tell you what you could do. So if someone's paying for that student, there should be an agreement the student signed, and in there it should make it clear that transcript or whatever information the party paying wants to get, that should be part of that agreement. If it's not, then these are providers that you work with on a regular basis. You can certainly give them the language that should be in there to allow you to disclose whatever they want to have disclosed. They just need to make sure and have the student that's part of the application the student would provide in order to have them pay.
Yep. Janet, there's a nuance to your question that I want to just tease out. You says our partnership team would like to use a single release form to send transcripts to the employer at the end of each semester for the student's entire enrollment. Are you asking that there can be one form and all students who are sponsored by that corporation can get transcripts at once? I'm not entirely sure if you're asking about single release instead of having each student having to release, or if it's if you're trying to send all transcripts. So maybe you can let us know in chat and I can come back to that one so I can see what you mean on that one. For me, being at a community college before I came to University of Washington, we had lots and lots of what we called third-party sponsored. And I always felt it was really important that even though FERPA would allow when there was a contract or an arrangement in place to share attendance and grades, I always wanted the student to know about the arrangement so that they could understand if they had any questions about it. So the question was, I was just wondering if we needed a new release each semester from each student.
So if you're getting a release from the student, that's a different issue. You don't need, you wouldn't do that under the financial aid exception. You're going to do it under 99.30, which is assigned consent. If you have that consent from the student, then you can forward that information. And if it's to the same party each and every semester, you don't need to get a new consent. You just need that consent to make it clear that they can send information to that party and that there's not an end date to when they can do that.
Yep, that's great.
Yeah.
Just make sure that someone's keeping an eye on those agreements. And especially if you're new to your role, the first thing you want to do is go to your accounts receivable, whoever team it is, and say, I need to see all the agreements we have so you can read through it and be aware of what you have out there, because sometimes these are 20 years old and no one's taking a look at them. So, yeah. All right, this is a good question. This is about former students, LeRoy. It says, if a student provides consent, is it okay to upload documents electronically and answer questions electronically for background checks for former students for employment? So if the student is given consent, is it okay to upload documents electronically and answer questions electronically for background checks for former students for employment?
The quick answer is yes, if they've given consent. Consent gets anyone anything for any purpose. You just want to make sure the consent covers what you're disclosing.
So let's talk about former students for a second. So if someone had a directory opt-out where they had left that when they left the institution, let's say they graduated or discontinued enrolling, what are the rules around whether you can acknowledge their attendance, and when do they stop being a current student and they become a former student in the eyes of FERPA?
So in the eyes of FERPA, there's no such thing as a former student. There's a student. That's a defined term. Anyone who is or has been, so that captures the former student. But the definition is always just that of a student. And in terms of, let's take the example you just gave, Helen, where someone's opted out of directory information. You're not operating under directory information with the example that was just given.
Yeah.
You're operating with a consent. As long as you have the consent, it doesn't matter that they opted out of directory information. It just means you can't respond to a request for directory information on that student unless, again, they've given consent for whatever party's asking.
That's great, good. And you might check out what is not listed in FERPA, but what are known as alumni records. And these are records that are created after the student has left your institution. So if you have questions on that later, let us know. Different than
one thing I'll mention on that, Helen, just in terms of one of the exceptions to the definition, the broad definition of an education record, is what Helen just mentioned, which are alumni records, which are records created and maintained after the student is no longer attending. But if you have records, if you create records after the, so that's primarily, say, address change, name change, career update, that sort of information would be alumni information. If you create records, let's say you have an issue, maybe you uncover a financial aid irregularity after the student leaves, you do an investigation, you create a report on that, that's still going to be an education record, even though the student's no longer attending, because it relates exclusively to their time when they were attending.
Great, fantastic. Okay, next question. LeRoy, can you clarify what directory information is according to FERPA? Also, can individual institutions deem what directory information is for their institution?
Sure. So in the definition of directory information, 99.3 directory information, you would see that the definition is information that's not generally considered harmful or invasion of privacy if it's disclosed. And then you'd see a list of items that could be directory information. It's up to the institution, though, to determine among that list what you want to include as your directory information. You don't have to include all of it. You can pick and choose, but whatever you publish, because you're required to annually notify, at least annually notify students in attendance, whatever you publish, you have to abide by that. So if you don't have photograph as a directory information item at your institution, and you want to do a directory with pictures, you're looking at consents from all the students because you couldn't do it under the directory information exception because you didn't list photograph as a directory information item. You would have to re-notify students of your change to your directory information definition, which you could do, and it would be the simplest way to do it, but you would need to do that and list photograph in order to do something like that.
Thank you. And if you're responsible for training on your campus, I think the number one area that people do not understand is what is directory information, what is directory information at my institution, and how does an opt-out apply? I can't tell you how many people get that confused and think that because somebody hasn't opted out of their directory information, that select list that you've identified being shared, then you can share anything with anyone. So if you're doing training for people on your campus, a really great start is to go look at your FERPA policy, make sure they understand it, make sure they understand directory information. And I always say at my campus, if you cannot see in any given moment that someone has opted out of directory information, then you can give nothing out because you don't know that you could be violating that they've opted out. So this is the one area I think that people most misunderstand and needs the most attention and training. So I'm so glad you asked it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mentioned, yes, I was on the campus yesterday doing FERPA training and in the conversation, a question similar to this got about giving out education records. And so I used the classic line that when in doubt, don't give it out, which
Yeah.
I've heard from so many registrars, that,
I love that one. That's
including
good.
you, Helen, and
Yeah.
that you're never going to run into a problem not giving out the information except to the student. Then you have to give them the opportunity to inspect and review. Students, the only one to whom you have to provide access to whatever records exist. Every other opportunity for disclosing records is a permissible one, including responding to a signed consent from the student. The signed consent doesn't require you to disclose the information, it permits you to.
Great. All right, here's a scenario question, and the requester is asking if this is a FERPA violation. So they say, good day, and thank you for offering these sessions. You're welcome. Here's my question. An employee used their own documents to prove residency for tuition purposes for their husband. This is the issue. They accessed and updated their spouse's student records in the student information system to process the documents. There isn't a FERPA release from the student providing consent for their employee wife to access their records. Is this a FERPA violation?
So the wife is an employee, accessed the husband's records and added in that information. If the husband wanted to file a complaint, it would get investigated by the department.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't done. Under FERPA, the first exception to sign consent under FERPA 9931A1 is school officials with a legitimate educational interest, that you can provide, that the institutions can provide access and permit access to those school officials, but they have to have a legitimate educational interest in accessing that. This was a school official, but without a legitimate educational interest in accessing that her husband's records. Now, I'm guessing the husband probably wouldn't file a complaint because he probably gave the ability to access, but I don't know that. But anyway, it would be, the department would definitely investigate that.
Yeah, this is a juicy one. So we want to remember that this is all about what the student wants to register a complaint. If this happened on my campus and I knew about it, I would take away the access of the employee and we'd have a conversation about how you signed a form saying that you wouldn't use it for purposes of your job. This is not okay, regardless of what the student husband had to say. So that was a good one.
And that's a great point, Helen, that it's up to institutions to enforce FERPA, and it's the responsibility of institutions to enforce FERPA. So when you run up against something like this, which would clearly not be permitted under FERPA, that you use it to, and that opportunity to take action regarding that particular employee.
Yeah. It's really important, especially if any of you are coming from small institutions, small college towns, whatever it might be, where there's not a lot of deep resources. If someone's job requires them to have control over their family members' education records, this is not in the FERPA law, but the best practice is to get them to step away from that and have someone else step in so that there's no impropriety. So you wouldn't necessarily say it's a FERPA violation unless the student registered and it could be investigated, as LeRoy said, but it's a great opportunity to remind people that you may have had the best intention, but this is not okay. You can't use your access to systems to get to things that you don't have a legitimate educational interest and need to know. There's no way each year that wife is assessed on her ability to do a job on getting her husband's information. So definitely something to follow up on, but that was a great answer. Okay, so this goes back to the dependency, I guess I would say, clause or dependency provision within FERPA for parents who can have access if they can show tax dependency. So the question is, if you're using that dependency as dependence on their parents as a reason for disclosure, what process do you recommend for secure authentication?
So authentication that they are a dependent of the parent. So the exception is 99.31A8. says that if the student is a dependent of the student or the parent, that the institution may provide access to the parents of that particular student. It's a different definition than what you have under FSA for dependency. This one is specifically tied to the IRS tax code. It means students claim on the parent's tax return. So you would either need to see the tax return. They can white out numbers, but you would need to see that the student is claimed on the latest year's tax return. Their social security number appears on that tax return. Another way you could do it, and this came about, this is an inquiry from an institution when I was at the department. And actually, that letter is actually one of the letters I put in the AACRAO, the 2012 AACRAO FERPA guide. But this university asked if they could have a form that they provide to all of their students at enrollment time, at each enrollment period. And in there, the question is, there are two boxes. One of them says I am a dependent of my parents for tax purposes. The other one says I am not a dependent. That they could have that, have the student check the box, appropriate box, sign it, turn it in, and they could use that in lieu of a tax return. And Harmon said, yes, you could do it that way. So that's another way. And that letter is in the appendice and the AACRAO FERPA guide, or that form.
Great.
Actually, that form's in the forms section.
Wonderful. So this one's a little bit related. If a student has submitted a FERPA release for their parents, so they've completed the process at my institution that lets me release information to parents, what are the limitations on the information you can share with them?
It depends on what the form says and what you provide him. So the institution where I was doing training yesterday, they only have one option. You give parents the ability to see your education records, or you don't. If you fill out the form, you don't get the option of limiting what part of the education record they can see. So in those instances, if that student signs that form, then academic, disciplinary, financial, any information can be shared with that parent. Don't have to, only the student, but you're permitted to do that based on that consent from the student. On the other hand, if you look at the section in the AACRAO FERPA guide on forms, you would see a number of forms that institutions from institutions, that's where we got them, from different institutions and examples and put in there. And you see everything from what this institution I was at yesterday, what they do, versus other institutions who give the multiple choice on what the student is giving the parents to see. So it's really up to the institution how they want to operate on that. But you have to honor, if you give choices, then that's all you can provide. So if the student says you can give my parents access to my financial records, then that's the only part you can. If they don't limit it, then you can provide them to access to any education records.
Sounds good. We've got about 10 more minutes and about 29 more questions. So please take note of my email address right there. If you can see it in my Zoom window, helenbg@uw.edu, like Helen boy girl at UW. If you want to go ahead and just copy the question that you've posted and send it to my email, I will answer it. And if I need LeRoy's help, I'll reach out to him because we may not get to everybody's, and the session is being recorded, that you'll be able to go back and watch it to hear the answers here. So we'll keep going. Lots of questions about parents, and right now enrollment is really critical in many of our institutions. So there's a fine line between not upsetting our parents but also making sure we're not violating FERPA. So the question is, can you briefly share how you manage parent guardians requesting access to student information like being copied on emails we send to students prior to the start of classes, trying to balance between navigating student privacy with retention being open and helpful and making the transition to college as easy as possible. It's kind of getting back to when is the student and probably consent. But yeah, so what would be your advice about navigating that careful moment before they start or maybe meet the definition of a student?
Right. So in FERPA and what the department has said in terms of students in attendance, when does an applicant become a student? This letter is also in the actual FERPA guide. We answered it a number of years ago. And in there, the question was from the time you accept someone until the first day of class, where along that spectrum do they become a student in attendance? What the department said was you, as an institution, can make that call so long as you do two things. One, you have some reasonable basis for it. At some logical point, you're saying cannot be later than the first day of class, and you have to apply it consistently. So you can't have different measures for different students. It's all going to be it's got to be consistent. So as long as you do that, until they become a student under your defined definition there, and again, it can't be later than the first day of class. Occasionally I'll be on campuses where they say, well, we don't consider them a student until after the add drop period. And my response to that is, well, you got records on a student for 2 weeks or however long your add drop, because if you let them in class, they're a student. They might not be a student for very long, but any records you continue to maintain are going to be educational records. But the advantage to waiting longer is that you can have conversations prior to that with parents and that sort of thing under FERPA. Now, one thing you always got to keep in mind is state law. So you're in Texas, you've got a state law that can severely limit that ability to do that, and other states may as well. So you just always need to be aware of your state laws that afford greater protection than what FERPA does.
Perfect, thank you. All right, we're going to switch over and talk about third-party vendor products and relations with third-party vendors. A few of my big FERPA issues as of late have been related to features of third-party vendor products, which have not been designed with FERPA in mind. Any suggestions on how to influence vendors to ensure our products enable the right levels of access to protect student privacy?
Yeah, and this is a really complex issue and one that creates a lot of problems for institutions, and part of that stems from a lack of oversight on who signs contracts and who reviews contracts. What you want to do when I'm doing training, I'm saying two parties should always see any contract. One is the registrar's office and one's your legal counsel, where there are FERPA eyes on that contract. Because if you let the vendor create the contract, their issue is not FERPA and protecting you. Their issue is convincing you that what they are providing you is a great thing. And I mean, I've yet to meet a vendor who didn't say they were FERPA compliant. And as I say, some of them actually were. So you really gotta look long and hard at these contracts and not just go blindly along and saying, oh, this is a great deal for us. This product is really, and a lot of times in particular with IT may find things that can be really helpful, but they're not necessarily thinking of FERPA. So it's really important that your IT folks be trained in FERPA and looking at what these contracts and these products contain. Because again, while FERPA is technology neutral, if you've got a vendor that's causing you to violate FERPA, that's on the institution, not on the vendor. And so there are institutions out there who won't sign contracts with vendors unless they've had a third party review them for FERPA compliance.
Right. Okay, here's a popular one. Admissions office likes to try and have prospective students sit in on active classes. Would having a prospective student sit in a class be a violation of FERPA, as the roster of the class is somewhat exposed?
Having someone, a prospective student sit into class is not going to be, you can look at that more under a pedagogical realm, and the department's never going to investigate someone because you let them sit in on a class, because you're not generally, I mean, somebody who's there and is not a student isn't going to be bothered with that. They're not even going to look at the roster, because they're not going to be signing up on them. And any other information that might be disclosed, if there's something being disclosed that's inappropriate for the visiting student to hear or see, is also going to be inappropriate for any other student to hear or see. So if you're
Right.
talking about somebody's failure in a class or something, it doesn't matter that you got a lot of other problems without, other than the visiting student there.
Good one. All right, we get a lot of private investigators that bring in a consent with an electronic signature from the student. Should we accept that? Currently, we reach out to the student, give them 14 days to decline us releasing the information. Also, is there anything else we should be collecting from the private investigator as far as checking credentials?
So by talking about private investigators, you're talking about for federal employment, the Office of Personnel Management may have investigators come around if a student's applied for a position working for the federal government, or certain agencies may send someone around. In those instances, they always have consent. That's an automatic with your application. If you're applying to work with the federal government, you're giving consent. So if that's what it is, if it's a private investigator for, and nowadays, the consent is generally electronic for applications for federal employment, but they always have that signature. But if you're talking about other than federal employment, then I'm going to be very cautious about accepting an electronic signature. There is a provision in FERPA that says in 9930 that you can accept electronic signature, but envisioned in that is that the institution creates the electronic signature, not that someone else does. Again, if it's the federal government and federal employment, then they would have authenticated those that electronic signature. They're going to know. But if it's someone else, I have no idea of what the level of authentication was that they might have used. So I'm going to be very reluctant to provide anything under that one.
So colleagues, thank you so much for attending. As I said, I apologize we didn't get to everyone's questions. You are welcome to email me at helenbg@uw, and I'll either respond or get help from LeRoy. LeRoy, thank you so much for being willing to test this out. It looks like it was successful. Velma, thank you to you and your AACRAO colleagues. Yeah, good questions. And make sure that you get the AACRAO FERPA guide if you don't have it. I am kind of an expert and I look at this thing all the time. And we'll be back each quarter. I think we're looking around September 20th. So come back and tell your friends. And thank you so much for participating. Again, send those emails to me, helenbg@uw, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.